The bank lobby was quiet when Daniel Harper heard the words that crushed his chest. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harper. Your loan application has been denied." He stood there in his worn jacket, fingers tightening around a folder filled with pay stubs, medical bills, and a crumpled drawing his daughter had slipped inside for luck. He nodded politely, thanked the clerk, and walked out as if the floor beneath him hadn't just disappeared. Outside, the late afternoon sun felt cruelly bright. Daniel sat in his old car for several minutes, staring at the steering wheel, wondering how a man who worked 2 jobs and never missed a payment could still be considered too risky. That loan wasn't for a luxury or a dream, it was for survival. The roof of their small apartment leaked every time it rained, his daughter's asthma medication was getting more expensive, and the daycare had given him a final warning. Daniel was a single father, and every decision he made carried the weight of another tiny life depending entirely on him. He told himself he could figure something out, like he always did. He drove home, cooked dinner, helped with homework, and smiled when his daughter laughed, never letting her see the fear growing inside him. When she finally fell asleep, he sat alone at the kitchen table, counting bills he already knew wouldn't add up. Then, at 10:47 p.m., his phone vibrated on the table. An unknown number. Daniel almost ignored it. Almost. When he answered, a calm, unfamiliar voice said, "Mr. Harper, this is Linda Morales, the bank manager you met today." His heart stopped. She was calling at night, for a reason he couldn't understand. As Daniel listened in silence, he had no idea that this single phone call was about to change everything he believed about fairness, failure, and what happens when someone finally chooses to look past the numbers. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like you did everything right, followed every rule, worked harder than most people around you, and still ended up being told no? That's exactly where Daniel Harper found himself on the night his phone rang. For millions of Americans, stories like his don't start with dramatic headlines or sudden miracles. They start quietly, in small apartments, after long shifts, when kids are asleep and the bills are spread out on the table. Daniel's life wasn't falling apart because of bad choices or reckless decisions. It was unraveling because sometimes effort isn't enough in a system that only sees numbers. And yet, that late-night call from the bank manager wasn't just about a loan. It was the beginning of a chain reaction, one that would force strangers to confront their own assumptions, and push a single father to the edge of hope and despair more than once. As this story unfolds, you'll see how one ordinary decision inside a bank office set off consequences that reached far beyond money, credit scores, or paperwork. You'll witness moments of quiet strength, painful humiliation, unexpected kindness, and choices that can't be undone once they're made. And before we dive into Daniel's journey, take a second to tell us in the comments, what city are you listening from right now? It's always powerful to see how far stories like this travel, connecting people from all over the country who understand what it means to struggle, to care, and to keep going even when the odds don't feel fair. Daniel barely slept that night. After the call ended, he sat on the edge of his bed, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to silence. The bank manager hadn't explained much, only that she needed to speak with him again, urgently, and that he should come to the branch first thing in the morning. No promises. No apologies. Just a tone that made his stomach tighten. Daniel stared at the ceiling, wondering how one conversation could reopen a door he'd already watched slam shut. Morning came too fast. He packed his daughter Lily's lunch, tying the brown paper bag the way her mother used to before she passed away 3 years earlier. Lily talked about a spelling test and a school play, unaware that her father's mind was racing through worst-case scenarios. Daniel smiled, nodded, and kissed her forehead, silently promising he would protect her from whatever storm was coming, even though he had no idea how. On the bus ride to work, Daniel replayed the loan denial over and over. The polite smiles. The rehearsed sympathy. The quiet judgment hiding behind professional language. He'd felt small sitting across that polished desk, like his entire life had been reduced to a few numbers on a screen. He told himself not to get his hopes up about the manager's call. Hope, he'd learned, could hurt more than rejection. That fragile resolve shattered when his phone buzzed with a message from Lily's school nurse. Asthma flare-up. Please call immediately. Daniel's hands shook as he dialed, heart pounding harder with every ring. The nurse assured him Lily was stable, but hearing his daughter struggle to breathe, again, ripped something open inside him. He leaned against the bus window, eyes burning, realizing that the loan wasn't about repairs or convenience. It was about keeping his child safe. And he was running out of time. He left work early, unpaid, and picked Lily up from school. She tried to be brave, clutching her inhaler and telling him she was okay now. Daniel nodded, but inside, fear coiled tighter. Medical bills were already stacked in a drawer at home, unopened because looking at them felt like drowning. He wondered how many more times life would ask him to choose between showing up and staying afloat. That afternoon, Daniel stood in front of the bank again, staring at the glass doors. People walked in and out, laughing, checking their phones, living lives untouched by the kind of quiet panic that lived in his chest. He almost turned around. Pride told him to walk away. Desperation pushed him forward. He stepped inside, the air-conditioned calm mocking his racing thoughts. Linda Morales, the bank manager, met him in her office with the same composed expression as the day before. She gestured for him to sit, folded her hands, and began explaining policies, exceptions, and risk assessments. Daniel listened, barely breathing. Every sentence felt like a tightrope walk between hope and humiliation. He nodded when expected, spoke when asked, and tried not to let his voice betray how much this moment mattered. As the meeting went on, Daniel noticed something shift. Linda's eyes lingered on his paperwork longer than necessary. She asked questions no one had asked before, about Lily, about his work schedule, about how he'd managed since becoming a single father. For the first time, it felt like someone was seeing beyond the numbers. Still, Daniel didn't let himself believe. He'd been disappointed too many times. When the meeting ended, Linda told him she needed time, just a little more time, to review everything personally. Daniel thanked her and stood up, forcing his legs to move. Walking out of the bank, he felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Nothing had been decided. Everything was still on the line. That evening, as Daniel tucked Lily into bed, his phone buzzed again on the nightstand. He glanced at the screen and froze. It was a message from Linda Morales. Mr. Harper, I found something you need to see. Please call me as soon as you can. Daniel stared at the message for a long moment before calling back. His heart hammered as the line rang, every second stretching thin. When Linda answered, her voice sounded different, lower, cautious, as if she were choosing each word carefully. She asked if he was somewhere private. Daniel stepped onto the balcony, the cold night air biting his skin, and told her he was listening. Whatever she had found, he sensed it wasn't just good news or bad news. It was something complicated. Linda explained that while reviewing his file, she'd noticed inconsistencies, not in Daniel's documents, but in the bank's automated risk assessment. His credit score didn't reflect several years of on-time rent payments, nor did it account for a small education grant he'd repaid early after his wife's death. The system doesn't like gaps, she said quietly. And your life has gaps it doesn't understand. Daniel closed his eyes, gripping the railing, anger and relief mixing in his chest. The next morning, Daniel returned to the bank once more. This time, he noticed things he hadn't before, the nervous intern at the front desk, the faint crack in the marble floor, the way everyone seemed rushed and tired. He wondered how many lives passed through these doors every day, reduced to charts and algorithms. Linda met him with a folder thicker than the last, her expression serious but not unkind. As they went through the documents together, Daniel felt the weight of his story pressing against the sterile paperwork. He explained the months he'd missed work while Lily's mother was in the hospital, the medical debt that followed her funeral, the nights he slept in his car so Lily could stay close to her school. His voice broke despite his efforts to stay composed. He wasn't asking for sympathy, he was asking to be understood. And for the first time, it seemed like someone was actually listening. The emotional dam broke when Linda paused, removed her glasses, and said, "Mr. Harper, I lost my father when I was 8. The room went quiet. She told him how her mother had been denied a loan years ago, how they'd nearly lost their home, and how that moment had shaped her career. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't just a meeting anymore, it was two lives colliding in a place that rarely allowed humanity through its doors. Linda warned him the process wouldn't be easy. Overriding the system meant scrutiny, risk, and consequences for her position. She explained internal audits, compliance checks, and the very real possibility of being reprimanded or worse. Daniel shook his head, telling her he didn't want her to risk her job. He'd lived long enough carrying guilt he didn't deserve. But Linda's eyes were steady. "Sometimes," she said, "doing nothing is the bigger risk." By late afternoon, Linda submitted a manual review request, something rarely approved. Daniel left the bank again with no clear answer, only a promise that a decision would come within 48 hours. The waiting felt unbearable. Every ring of his phone made his chest seize. Every passing hour felt like borrowed time he didn't know how to repay. That night, Lily's breathing worsened. Daniel sat on the bathroom floor with her, counting breaths, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed himself. The inhaler helped, but barely. He stared at the medicine cabinet, at bottles nearly empty, and felt a surge of helpless rage. He wasn't failing because he didn't care. He was failing because the margin for error had vanished. In the early hours of the morning, Daniel's phone rang. A number he didn't recognize flashed on the screen. He answered, voice hoarse with exhaustion. It wasn't Linda. It was someone from the bank's risk department, speaking in clipped, formal tones. Daniel listened, heart racing, as the man said, "Mr. Harper, we need to discuss your application immediately. There's been a complication." Daniel sank back against the wall, holding Lily close as she slept against his chest. A complication could mean anything. And deep down, he feared this time, the system had finally decided his story was too heavy to carry. Daniel arrived at the bank before it opened, Lily bundled in a borrowed jacket, her small hand wrapped tightly around his. He had no one else to leave her with, and the risk department's call had been vague enough to terrify him. When the doors finally unlocked, a security guard hesitated at the sight of a child, then stepped aside without a word. Daniel felt exposed, as if bringing Lily made his desperation visible to everyone in the building. They were led into a conference room on the second floor, larger, colder, with a long table that felt designed to keep people small. Two men from the risk department sat across from him, their laptops already open. Linda Morales entered last, nodding briefly to Daniel before taking a seat beside them. Her presence steadied him, even as his stomach twisted. This was no longer a personal conversation. It was a judgment. One of the men began outlining concerns: debt-to-income ratio, inconsistent employment history, non-traditional risk factors. The words blurred together. Daniel listened, nodding mechanically, while Lily swung her legs under the chair, humming softly to herself. He wondered if they noticed her at all, or if she was just another variable they hadn't accounted for. The moment cracked open when Lily suddenly started coughing. Sharp, dry, panicked. Daniel was on his feet instantly, kneeling beside her, pulling out the inhaler with shaking hands. The room fell silent except for Lily's wheezing breaths. Daniel's voice trembled as he coached her through it, counting aloud, whispering encouragement. Tears slid down his face before he realized they were there. In that instant, the polished table, the laptops, the policies, they all disappeared. There was only a father fighting to keep his child breathing. When Lily finally calmed, the room felt different. One of the men cleared his throat and looked away. Linda leaned forward, her expression tight with emotion she didn't bother to hide. Daniel apologized automatically, embarrassment flooding him. "I can come back another time," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to," Linda cut him off gently. "No. This is exactly why we're here. She turned to the risk officers and spoke with a firmness Daniel hadn't heard before. She pointed out discrepancies in the model, blind spots in how hardship was measured, and the long-term cost of denying stability to families already on the edge. She wasn't pleading. She was arguing, logically, relentlessly. Daniel watched, stunned, as someone else carried his burden out loud. The discussion stretched on for nearly an hour. Daniel answered questions when asked, his voice steadier now, though his hands still shook. He talked about budgeting every dollar, about choosing night shifts to be home during Lily's worst asthma seasons, about turning down promotions because they meant losing health coverage. The men listened, truly listened, and for the first time, the room felt less like a courtroom and more like a reckoning. Eventually, one of the risk officers closed his laptop. He said they would escalate the case to the regional board, an uncommon move that could take days. Daniel's heart sank. Days were a luxury he didn't have. Linda noticed and met his eyes. "I'll do everything I can to speed this up," she said softly. It wasn't a promise of approval. It was a promise of effort. And somehow, that meant more. As Daniel gathered Lily and prepared to leave, one of the men hesitated, then reached into his pocket and slid a business card across the table. "If there's an emergency," he said quietly, "call me directly." Daniel blinked, surprised. It wasn't the loan. But it was something human, something unexpected. Outside, the sky was gray and heavy. Daniel buckled Lily into her seat and sat behind the wheel, exhausted beyond words. His phone buzzed before he could start the engine. A notification from his landlord. Final notice. Repairs delayed. Rent increase effective immediately. Daniel closed his eyes, gripping the steering wheel. The board hadn't decided yet. Time was slipping away. And he had no idea which would reach him first, the help he was fighting for, or the consequences he could no longer outrun. The next 3 days felt longer than the previous 3 years combined. Daniel checked his phone obsessively, even during work, knowing every vibration could change his life, or confirm that nothing ever would. The landlord's notice sat folded in his jacket pocket like a quiet threat, heavy and unavoidable. At night, he lay awake listening to Lily's breathing, counting the seconds between each inhale, wondering how close he was to losing the fragile balance he'd fought so hard to maintain. On the second day, the ceiling in the apartment finally gave way. Rainwater dripped steadily onto the kitchen floor, pooling beneath a plastic bucket Daniel had placed there weeks earlier. This time, the bucket overflowed. Lily watched from the doorway, eyes wide. "Daddy, is our house broken?" she asked. Daniel swallowed hard and forced a smile. "No, sweetheart," he said. "We're just going through a rough patch." The lie tasted bitter, but he didn't know what else to give her. By the third morning, Daniel received a call from his employer. They needed him to pick up extra shifts, or risk losing his position altogether. Exhausted and desperate, he agreed, even though it meant leaving Lily with a neighbor he barely knew. Guilt gnawed at him as he walked away, his mind split between earning enough to survive and being present enough to protect his daughter. He felt like he was failing at both. The breaking point came that afternoon when the neighbor called, panic in her voice. Lily had collapsed during play, her breathing shallow and fast. Daniel left work without a word, sprinting to the bus stop, heart hammering with every step. At the hospital, he held Lily's hand as doctors moved efficiently around them. When the doctor finally looked at him and said, "She needs a more stable environment," Daniel felt the words land like a verdict. Stable. The one thing he couldn't provide. Hours later, alone in the waiting room, Daniel stared at the hospital bill estimate on his phone. The numbers blurred. He thought about the bank, the board, the delay. He thought about how close he was to losing everything. For the first time since his wife died, Daniel bowed his head and cried, not quietly, not politely, but with the raw grief of a man who had reached the end of his strength. His phone rang while tears still streaked his face. Linda Morales. Daniel almost didn't answer. He couldn't bear another careful explanation or procedural delay. But when he picked up, Linda didn't speak right away. "Daniel," she said softly, "are you sitting down?" His heart clenched. He told her where he was. There was a pause on the line, long enough to make his breath hitch. "The regional board reviewed your case this morning," Linda said. "It wasn't unanimous. There was a lot of pushback." Daniel closed his eyes, bracing himself. She continued, her voice steady but emotional. "But I did something I wasn't supposed to do. I brought your file in person. I told them about Lily." Silence followed, heavy and terrifying. Daniel's chest tightened as Linda finally said, "They approved the loan." The words didn't register at first. "Approved. Loan." He asked her to repeat it. She did, and this time, her voice cracked. "The approval came with conditions, strict oversight, frequent reviews, but it was real. The money would be available within 48 hours. Daniel sank back into the chair, shaking, laughter and sobs colliding in his throat. Linda wasn't finished. She explained that her actions hadn't gone unnoticed. There would be an internal investigation. Her position was at risk. Daniel protested immediately, guilt surging. She stopped him gently. "If I lose my job," she said, "I'll still sleep at night. And that matters more." Daniel had no words. Gratitude felt too small. That night, Daniel returned home alone. The apartment was dark and damp, the bucket still catching water from the ceiling. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to imagine repairs, medication, stability. But as he sat on the edge of the bed, his phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unknown number. "Mr. Harper, this is the bank's compliance office. We need to discuss irregularities related to your loan approval immediately." Daniel stared at the screen, heart sinking. The loan was approved, but the fight was far from over. The compliance office meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Daniel barely slept, the word irregularities echoing in his mind like a warning siren. Approval or not, he knew how fragile his situation was. One signature, one accusation, one technicality could erase everything. At dawn, he dressed quietly and left Lily sleeping, promising himself this meeting would be the last obstacle between them and stability. The compliance office felt colder than the rest of the bank, stripped of warmth and color. Two auditors sat across from Daniel, faces unreadable, a thick file placed neatly between them. They spoke in careful, neutral tones, explaining that Linda Morales had bypassed standard procedures. Her actions, they said, could be interpreted as personal bias. Daniel's stomach twisted. He realized this wasn't just about him anymore, it was about protecting the institution from accountability. When they asked Daniel to describe his interactions with Linda, he answered honestly. He didn't exaggerate or defend her recklessly. He spoke about fairness, transparency, and the fact that she had treated him like a human being, not a statistic. His voice shook when he admitted that without her intervention, his daughter's health, and possibly their home, would have been lost. He wasn't trying to manipulate them. He was telling the truth. The emotional weight of the moment hit when one of the auditors asked, "Do you believe you deserve this loan?" Daniel hesitated. He thought of every night shift, every missed meal, every sacrifice Lily would never know about. Tears welled in his eyes as he answered, "I believe my daughter deserves a safe place to breathe." The room fell silent. For the first time, the auditors looked unsettled. After what felt like an eternity, they dismissed Daniel, saying a final decision would be communicated later that day. He left the building drained, unsure whether he'd helped or hurt Linda's case. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing monumental was unfolding inside his chest. He checked his phone compulsively, waiting for news that refused to arrive. Back at the hospital, Lily slept peacefully, her color improved. Daniel sat beside her bed, holding her hand, whispering stories about the future, about fixing the roof, painting her room, maybe even buying her a bike. He stopped himself when he realized how dangerous hope could be. Still, he couldn't help it. Hope crept in anyway. Late that afternoon, Daniel's phone rang. This time, it was Linda. Her voice was calm, but tired. The compliance office had completed their review. Her actions were deemed procedurally inappropriate but ethically defensible. She would receive a formal warning, but she was keeping her job. Daniel let out a shaky breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, warm and overwhelming. Then Linda told him the second part. The loan would stand. Not only that, but the bank had decided to pilot a new manual review process for hardship cases, because of his file. Daniel was speechless. His struggle, his humiliation, his fear, it had forced change. Linda laughed softly through her exhaustion. You reminded them why banks exist in the first place, she said. 2 days later, the funds were released. Daniel paid the medical bills, secured proper repairs for the apartment, and arranged safer childcare. The leaks were fixed. The walls dried. The air inside their home felt cleaner, lighter. Lily's breathing improved almost immediately. She smiled more. She slept through the night. Daniel watched her with a mixture of joy and disbelief. Weeks passed, and life began to feel steady for the first time in years. Daniel returned to the bank, not as a desperate applicant, but as a man standing on firmer ground. He thanked Linda in person, awkwardly, sincerely. She told him she was glad she answered the phone that night. So was he. On a quiet evening, as Daniel tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at him and said, "Daddy, are we safe now?" Daniel smiled, brushing her hair back gently. "Yes," he said. And for the first time, he knew it was true. In the months that followed, Daniel's life didn't turn into a fairy tale, but it became something far more meaningful, stable, honest, and quietly hopeful. The repaired apartment became a real home, not just a place to survive the night. Lily's laughter filled rooms that once echoed with worry, and her health improved as the stress that had wrapped itself around their lives slowly loosened its grip. Daniel kept working hard, but now his effort finally led somewhere tangible. He paid his loan on time, rebuilt his credit, and earned a promotion that allowed him to be home when Lily needed him most. Occasionally, he would think back to that moment in the bank lobby when he was told no, and he realized something important. It wasn't the rejection that defined him, but what happened after. One person chose to look past a system and see a human being, and that choice rippled outward, changing policies, perspectives, and 2 lives forever. Linda remained at the bank, mentoring younger managers, teaching them that numbers tell a story, but never the whole one. And Daniel carried forward a quiet confidence, not born from luck or charity, but from resilience. He had stood at the edge of losing everything and refused to disappear. For the audience watching, his story wasn't about money or loans, it was about dignity, about the unseen strength of parents who keep going when no one is watching, and about how sometimes, the smallest acts of courage happen behind closed doors, late at night, with nothing but a ringing phone and a decision that can change everything.